Hey guys, glad to be back with y'all. Excited still about this route we're taking with the students. I know there's going to be some learning curves, some challenges, some adjustments to be made. So don't be discouraged. We'll give it some more time and continue to pray, continue to work, and see what happens. So this week we're going to be talking about Genesis 2, the creation of mankind. So this is actually chapter 2 zooms in on day 6 of creation. And so it's not a second creation of mankind. There's a lot of dispute about this, but it's just God has given us a magnified version of what happened on the 6th day of creation when He created man and woman. And so it's important to note on this when we're reading through it. I've kind of bolded the important sections, and so it's a long chapter, and there's some things that they're important, but not as important as what we want to focus on. And so I've bolded the text that I really want us to read and focus on in your groups this week. And so I'll walk through these questions real quick and briefly hit these, and I'll send these over to y'all. But we see on the 7th day that God, He rested. And what I believe this teaches us is that as humans, we need rest. He was laying out a model for us. And so he modeled that on the 7th day, one day of the week, we should rest as humans. And then we see, how did God create man? Well, He created man from the dust and the ground and by breathing life into us. And so that's significant, and also ties into being made in the image of God, which is those things should encourage us. And then we talk about the trees that were planted in the garden. So the tree of life and the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And some of the questions that may come out of here is, why did God place those trees in the garden and allow man to have access to them? Those are good questions, ones that we don't necessarily have the answers to. And so if the students ask that question, don't be fearful of that. It's okay to ask that question. I have that question, a matter of fact, so it's no problem. And then we see on question 4, what was the man's responsibility in the garden? This is important, is that man, he did have a job to do in the garden. He was to cultivate the ground, work the ground, farm it, take care of it. He actually even was supposed to name the animals. He did name the animals. And so we see that man had a responsibility to do. It wasn't kick your feet up, relax, and do nothing. He had a job to do, and he had chores to do and tasks to do. And this is why I believe when we get to heaven, we will have jobs to do. We'll have responsibility. It's not a sit back, kick back, relax, and people serving us grapes all day. It's we're going to have a job to do. It's going to be work, but we see that it was enjoyable, that it wasn't hard until after the fall of man, and so that's important to note. And we see that man, even in this garden, he had rules and restrictions, and the rule was, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was his rule. That was a rule that God gave to Adam and eventually Eve, and we'll see next week that they broke that rule. And we see that God, He laid out the consequence for breaking the rule on question 6. The consequence for eating of the tree of knowledge, good and evil, was death. And so we're not going to talk a lot about that this week, but next week that will be very important, the fact that death was the consequence. Because a question that should come up was, well, Adam and Eve didn't die. They didn't die immediately. Eventually they died. And so we'll talk about those consequences next week when we get into the actual, when they break the rules. And then we see on question 7 something I think is really cool that stands out to me, is that God, He gives the woman a title helper. And some people can take that negative, that, oh, the woman has to help the man, and that's her role in everything, is that she always has to help the man. So the man can work, he can do all these things, and the woman helps her. Well, it's not meant to be a negative term. And actually, women, ladies, you're in good company, because another person that gets this name helper is the Holy Spirit. And so we know that He wasn't, when it comes to God, and we talk about the Trinity, we have the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all on even playing grounds. And just because the Holy Spirit was given the name helper doesn't mean that He's less than the Father and the Son. No, He was equal with them, but He was given this great term helper, and Jesus knew the significance of that. And ladies, it doesn't mean less than. A helper is actually a really prestigious title that a man, we don't get that type. We don't get lumped in called the same name as the Holy Spirit. And so it should be encouraging to you. And then the last few things here, we see that God, He performed the first marriage between Adam and Eve, and there's some parameters set that marriage is meant between man and woman. That's the primary thing we can learn from here. And then I believe this text is a good reminder that, and the application we should pull here is that God has given us responsibilities as humans. He's given us work to do, jobs to do. He's given us purpose, and I believe primarily that's to worship Him. And so our responsibilities, the tasks that we do every day, they should also be pointing to God and worshiping and glorifying God. And so these students, they're not just floating around, have no jobs, have no responsibilities. No, God's created them and given them responsibilities, and He's created them for unique purposes. And I believe that all of them and all of us are created to worship and glorify God. But now the students have to figure out what does that look like in their context, at their school, different things. And so that's the application, be thinking through that. And so that's some of the high points each week. Also, as you think about these questions, if you think they need to be modified, if they're over the kids' heads or not clear, man, let me know. I want to modify them and make them best for the students. So see y'all next time.